So world leaders converged in Egypt in the last 24 hours or so, for the Cairo Peace Summit, the aim to find a lasting solution to the Israel-Hamas fighting. News reports reveal that leaders from various countries have all basically left the gathering without reaching a consensus. For more on this, let's speak to Sari Bashi from Human Rights Watch. A very good evening to you, Sari. Good to have your time. So, a great deal of concern about the situation in Gaza, especially over the last 14 days or so. Was the gathering held in Egypt yesterday worth the trouble for the people of Gaza who are suffering at this moment?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
My question to you was whether the latest efforts at a conversation, a peace summit in Egypt yesterday, have been beneficial in any way to the plight of the people of the Gaza Strip who are suffering right now.
There's no change in the nightmare that has been taking place in Gaza for the last 2 weeks. Since October 7th, Israeli airstrikes have killed nearly 5,000 people, including nearly 2,000 children. On average, those airstrikes are killing 100 children a day. To make matters worse, the Israeli government has cut supplies to Gaza. They turned off the water and electricity that they usually supply. And until yesterday, no aid entered Gaza. Yesterday, a convoy of 20 trucks entered via the southern crossing with Egypt. And today, about another 19 trucks entered. It's a drop in the bucket for a place that is being systematically deprived of food, water, electricity, and everything else that people need in order to try to keep themselves safe and healthy.
And just on these trucks carrying aid, which have gone in 20, as you're saying, on Saturday, 19 today, Sunday, a drop in the bucket, as you say, because usually hundreds of trucks go into Gaza because ultimately it's an area so densely populated with very little resources, much of what goes in still controlled by Israel. And the ongoing issue now that Western leaders in particular have been avoiding or accused of avoiding is describing the situation as a violation of international humanitarian law by Israel. Is it a violation?
Yes, it is. So the Gaza Strip is surrounded on all sides by fences and walls and bordered by the sea, which the Israeli Navy patrols. The Israeli government has controlled the goods crossings into and out of Gaza for decades, and usually it allows about 500 trucks to enter every day to take care of the needs that people have in Gaza, as well as fuel, electricity, and water, which it sells to Gaza but provides through pipes and power lines. Let me say this certainly. On October 7th, Hamas-led fighters committed horrific crimes against Israeli civilians. They massacred children, they set fire to homes with families inside of them, and they took more than 200 people hostage. Those are horrific war crimes, and the reason they're so horrific is because they targeted civilians. The Israeli government's response has been to engage in collective punishment against civilians in Gaza, because in response, the Israeli government said it was going to cut all aid to Gaza, and the Israeli prime minister announced that he wasn't going to allow any humanitarian supplies into Gaza. Collective punishment is a war crime under international law. When you punish people, civilians, for the actions of fighters, it's collective punishment. In the case of Gaza, it's particularly troubling because there are 2.2 million people in Gaza, nearly half of whom are children. So children are being punished for the actions of adult fighters.
And the defense of the Israeli actions, as we say tonight, that what Hamas did, a clear-cut violation of international law, going into another country and murdering, as they did, civilians, but we're seeing also in Gaza a rising civilian death toll. And when this question is asked repeatedly to Israeli officials, American officials, British politicians as well, on the news stations there, the refrain is that Israel has a right and a duty to defend itself and its citizens. What does that mean for any future pursuit of justice for the civilians in Gaza? Because for the civilians in Israel who were murdered by Hamas, the government there has made it clear that it will avenge them by killing off Hamas.
My concern is not about vengeance, but rather about the very basic principle of international law that says you have to protect civilians. Western governments and other backers of Israel were justifiably abhorred by what Hamas did to Israeli civilians for the very reason that it violated this fundamental principle of targeting civilians. The answer cannot be for then the Israeli military to target civilians in Gaza. The fact that somebody else committed a war crime by massacring Israeli civilians doesn't mean that you get to commit a war crime against Palestinian civilians. There are things that can be done right now to help civilians in Gaza. Everybody is talking about trying to squeeze through a few trucks into the Egyptian crossing with Gaza, when the reality is the Israeli government can just reopen the water taps and the electricity grid that it shut down 2 weeks ago. Not only can it do it, it has an obligation to do it, because international humanitarian law requires an occupying power like Gaza, like Israel, to affirmatively supply the civilian population, and all parties to a conflict need to allow access for humanitarian aid. I'm disappointed that I'm not seeing more countries call for, first of all, for Israel to resume electricity and water supplies and to reopen its own crossings with Gaza. That is where the infrastructure is, and even in previous wars, the Israeli government has found ways to get trucks into Gaza, even under fire. That's what it needs to do right now, because the 20 trucks coming in yesterday and today from Rafah crossing are not nearly enough. It's less than the 500 that are needed, and it's less than the 100 trucks that the UN has said is the minimum to meet people's needs in Gaza. Gaza's main hospital, Shifa Hospital, is running out of water. They've run out of many vital medical supplies. There's no fuel to pump the sewage or to pump the water. We've started to see outbreaks of diseases, communicable diseases that are spread from poor sanitary conditions. People need water. It has nothing to do with the terrible crimes Hamas committed. Civilians and children in Gaza have a right to receive humanitarian aid.
And with that in mind then, how safe is it to get aid into Gaza? Only at this point, as we know, through the Rafah crossing with Egypt, because 2 weeks ago when there was the evacuation of people in Gaza ordered by Israel, people told to move from the north to the south, we've seen now that even in the south there has been bombardment in cities including Khan Yunis where some had fled.
There's no safe place in Gaza right now. On Friday, the Israeli military issued an evacuation order. A week ago, the Israeli military issued an evacuation order for more than 1 million people in northern Gaza, that's half the population, and told them to go south. But it didn't give them a safe way to get there, and there was no safe place to go to. Some of the families fleeing were killed by airstrikes as they fled via the routes that the Israeli military designated. And as you mentioned, the airstrikes continue in the south. I'm also concerned that the Israeli military is now urging people in northern Gaza to flee to the south, even if they can't, even if they're medical patients, even if they're people with disabilities, even if they don't have fuel to get there, and saying that humanitarian supplies are being allowed in the south only. The Israeli military has an obligation to ensure that all civilians in Gaza, whether or not they've evacuated the north, are supplied with humanitarian supplies. And the water and electricity can be turned on immediately without further logistical arrangements. And the crossings with Israel need to be opened as well so that all of Gaza is supplied. This is not a problem of inability. It's unwillingness. And that is where I would expect countries to make it clear that if they want Israel's backing in condemning and holding to account the Hamas-led fighters who massacred Israeli civilians, they also need to obey the law and protect civilians in Gaza.
And given that the world leaders are split, as was put on full display at the Peace Summit in Cairo yesterday, Western leaders in the main sticking with Israel, the likes of South Africa, making it clear that while they condemn the brutality of Hamas, their solidarity remains with the people of Palestine and their suffering, which has lasted decades. They are split clearly as world leaders. It's also reflected in the way in which resolutions or attempts at resolutions at the UN Security Council have been vetoed and failed. What does that mean for the role that organizations such as yourself now have to play? What are you able to do realistically?
Rights Watch is trying to do A few things. First of all, we are trying to get governments to consistently uphold the laws of war protections for civilians. And that's something that it shouldn't be as hard as it is, in the sense that if Western governments were so horrified by the attacks on Israeli civilians, they should be applying those same principles to protect Palestinian civilians. Beyond that, we are also pointing to some of the root causes of the violence. This didn't happen in a vacuum. For decades, the Israeli authorities have oppressed Palestinians. They're committing crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. And any longer-lasting solution to what's going on right now needs to address those root causes. South Africa knows a little bit about apartheid, and I'm glad to say that the South African government has been very helpful in raising concerns about apartheid in Israel-Palestine at the level of the UN. You should keep doing that. But in the immediate term, what we'd like the South African government to do is to make very specific demands around the need to have humanitarian assistance coming in, not just via Rafah, but also via the Israeli crossings.
So good to speak to you, Sari Bashi from Human Rights Watch, joining us from New York tonight. Thank you for your time.